Introduction. It is natural to suppose that, before philosophy enters upon its subject proper, namely, the actual knowledge of what truly is it, is necessary to come first to an understanding concerning knowledge, which is looked upon as the instrument by which to take possession of the absolute, or as the means through which to get a sight of it. The apprehension seems legitimate, on the one hand, that there may be various kinds of knowledge, among which one might be better adapted than another for the attainment of our purpose, and thus a wrong choice is possible. On the other hand again that, since knowing is a faculty of a definite kind and with a determinate range, without the more precise determination of its nature and limits we might take hold on clouds of error instead of the heaven of truth. This apprehensiveness is sure to pass even into the conviction that the whole enterprise which sets out to secure for consciousness by means of knowledge what exists per se, is in its very nature absurd, and that between knowledge and the absolute there lies a boundary which completely cuts off the one from the other. For if knowledge is the instrument by which to get possession of absolute reality, the suggestion immediately occurs that the application of an instrument to anything does not leave it as it is for itself, but rather entails in the process, and has in view, a molding, an alteration of it. Or, again, if knowledge is not an instrument which we actively employ, but a kind of passive medium through which the light of the truth reaches us, then here, too, we do not receive it as it is in itself, but as it is through and in this medium. In either case, we employ a means which immediately brings about the very opposite of its own end, or, rather, the absurdity lies in making use of any means at all. It seems indeed open to us to find in the knowledge of the way in which the instrument operates, a remedy for this parlous state, for thereby it becomes possible to remove from the result the part which, in our idea of the absolute received through that instrument, belongs to the instrument, and thus to get the truth in its purity. But this improvement would, as a matter of fact, only bring us back to the point where we were before. If we take away again from a definitely formed thing that which the instrument has done in the shaping of it, then the thing, in this case the absolute, stands before us once more just as it was previous to all this trouble, which, as we now see, was superfluous. If the absolute were only to be brought on the whole nearer to us by this agency, without any chance being wrought in it, like a bird caught by a lime stick, it would certainly scorn a trick of that sort, if it were not in its very nature, and did it not wish to be beside us from the start. For a trick is what knowledge in such a case would be, since by all its busy toil and trouble it gives itself the air of doing something quite different from bringing about a relation that is merely immediate, and so a waste of time to establish. Or, again, if the examination of knowledge, which we represent as a medium, makes us acquainted with the law of its refraction, it is likewise useless to eliminate this refraction from the result. For knowledge is not the divergence of the ray, but the ray itself by which the truth comes in contact with us, and if this be removed, the bare direction or the empty place would alone be indicated. Meanwhile, if the fear of falling into error introduces an element of distrust into science, which without any scruples of that sort goes to work and actually does know, it is not easy to understand why, conversely, a distrust should not be placed in this very distrust, and why we should not take care lest the fear of error is not just the initial error. As a matter of fact, this fear presupposes something, indeed a great deal, as truth, and supports its scruples and consequences on what should itself be examined beforehand to see whether it is truth. It starts with ideas of knowledge as an instrument, and as a medium, and presupposes a distinction of ourselves from this knowledge. More especially, it takes for granted that the absolute stands on one side, and that knowledge on the other side, by itself and cut off from the absolute, is still something real, in other words, that knowledge, which, by being outside the absolute, is certainly also outside truth, is nevertheless true, a position which, while calling itself fear of error, makes itself known rather as fear of the truth. This conclusion comes from the fact that the absolute alone is true, or that the true is alone absolute. It may be set aside by making the distinction that a knowledge which does not indeed know the absolute as science wants to do, is none the less true too, and that knowledge in general, though it may possibly be incapable of grasping the absolute, can still be capable of truth of another kind. But we shall see as we proceed that random talk like this leads in the long run to a confused distinction between the absolute truth and a truth of some other sort, and that absolute, knowledge, and so on, are words which presuppose a meaning that has first to be got at. With such like useless ideas and expressions about knowledge, as an instrument to take hold of the absolute, or as a medium through which we have a glimpse of truth, and so on, relations to which all these ideas of a knowledge which is divided from the absolute and an absolute divided from knowledge in the last resort lead, we need not concern ourselves. Nor need we trouble about the evasive pretexts which create the incapacity of science out of the presupposition of such relations, in order at once to be rid of the toil of science, and to assume the air of serious and zealous effort about it. Instead of being troubled with giving answers to all these, they may be straightway rejected as adventitious and arbitrary ideas, and the use which is here made of words like absolute, knowledge, as also objective and subjective, and innumerable others, whose meaning is assumed to be familiar to everyone, might well be regarded as so much deception. For to give out that their significance is universally familiar and that everyone indeed possesses their notion, rather looks like an attempt to dispense with the only important matter, which is just to give this notion. With better right, on the contrary, we might spare ourselves the trouble of talking any notice at all of such ideas and ways of talking which would have the effect of warding off science altogether, for they make a mere empty show of knowledge which at once vanishes when science comes on the scene. But science, in the very fact that it comes on the scene, is itself a phenomenon. Its coming on the scene is not yet itself carried out in all the length and breadth of its truth. In this regard, it is a matter of indifference whether we consider that it, science, is the phenomenon because it makes its appearance alongside another kind of knowledge, or call that other untrue knowledge its process of appearing. Science, however, must liberate itself from this phenomenality, and it can only do so by turning against it. For science cannot simply reject a form of knowledge which is not true, and treat this as a common view of things, and then assure us that itself is an entirely different kind of knowledge, and holds the other to be of no account at all, nor can it appeal to the fact that in this other there are presages of a better. By giving that assurance it would declare its force and value to lie in its bare existence, but the untrue knowledge appeals likewise to the fact that it is, and assures us that to it science is nothing. One barren assurance, however, is of just as much value as another. Still less can science appeal to the presages of a better, which are to be found present in untrue knowledge and are there pointing the way towards science, for it would, on the one hand, be appealing again in the same way to a merely existent fact, and, on the other, it would be appealing to itself, to the way in which it exists in untrue knowledge, that is, to a bad form of its own existence, to its appearance, rather than to its real and true nature. For this reason we shall here undertake the exposition of knowledge as a phenomenon. Now, because this exposition has for its object only phenomenal knowledge, the exposition itself seems not to be science, free, self-moving in the shape proper to itself, but may, from this point of view, be taken as the pathway of the natural consciousness which is pressing forward to true knowledge. Or it can be regarded as the path of the soul, which is traversing the series of its own forms of embodiment, like stages appointed for it by its own nature, that it may possess the clearness of spiritual life when, through the complete experience of its own self, it arrives at the knowledge of what it is in itself. Natural consciousness will prove itself to be only knowledge in principle or not real knowledge. Since, however, it immediately takes itself to be the real and genuine knowledge, this pathway has a negative significance for it. What is a realization of the notion of knowledge means for it rather the ruin and overthrow of itself, for on this road it loses its own truth. Because of that, the road can be looked on as the path of doubt, or more properly a highway of despair. For what happens there is not what is usually understood by doubting, a jostling against this or that supposed truth, the outcome of which is again a disappearance in due course of the doubt and a return to the former truth, so that at the end the matter is taken as it was before. On the contrary, that pathway is the conscious insight into the untruth of the phenomenal knowledge, for which that is the most real, which is after all only the unrealized notion. On that account, too, this thoroughgoing skepticism is not what doubtless earnest zeal for truth and science fancies it has equipped itself with in order to be ready to deal with them, for example, the resolve, in science, not to deliver itself over to the thoughts of others on their mere authority, but to examine everything for itself, and only follow its own conviction, or, still better, to produce everything itself and hold only its own act for true. The series of shapes, which consciousness traverses on this road, is rather the detailed history of the process of training and educating consciousness itself up to the level of science. That resolve presents this mental development in the simple form of an intended purpose, as immediately finished and complete, as having taken place. This pathway, on the other hand, is, as opposed to this abstract intention, or untruth, the actual carrying out of that process of development. To follow one's own conviction is certainly more than to hand oneself over to authority, but by the conversion of opinion held on authority into opinion held out of personal conviction, the content of what is held is not necessarily altered, and truth has not thereby taken the place of error. If we stick to a system of opinion and prejudice resting on the authority of others, or upon personal conviction, the one differs from the other merely in the conceit which animates the latter. Skepticism, directed to the whole compass of phenomenal consciousness, on the contrary, makes mind for the first time qualified to test what truth is, since it brings about a despair regarding what are called natural views, thoughts, and opinions, which it is matter of indifference to call personal or belonging to others, and with which the consciousness, that proceeds straight away to criticize and test, is still filled and hampered, thus being, as a matter of fact, incapable of what it wants to undertake. The completeness of the forms of unreal consciousness will be brought about precisely through the necessity of the advance and the necessity of their connection with one another. To make this comprehensible, we may remark, by way of preliminary, that the exposition of untrue consciousness in its untruth is not a merely negative process. Such a one-sided view of it is what the natural consciousness generally adopts, and a knowledge, which makes this one-sidedness its essence, is one of those shapes assumed by incomplete consciousness which falls into the course of the inquiry itself and will come before us there. For this view is skepticism, which always sees in the result only pure nothingness, and abstracts from the fact that this nothing is determinate, is the nothing of that out of which it comes as a result. Nothing, however, is only, in fact, the true result, when taken as the nothing of what it comes from. It is thus itself a determinate nothing, and has a content. The skepticism which ends with the abstraction nothing or emptiness can advance from this not a step farther, but must wait and see whether there is possibly anything new offered, and what that is in order to cast it into the same abysmal void. When once, on the other hand, the result is apprehended, as it truly is, as determinate negation, a new form has thereby immediately arisen, and in the negation the transition is made by which the progress through the complete succession of forms comes about of itself. The goal, however, is fixed for knowledge just as necessarily as the succession in the process. The terminus is at that point where knowledge is no longer compelled to go beyond itself, where it finds its own self, and the notion corresponds to the object and the object to the notion. The progress towards this goal consequently is without a halt, and at no earlier stage is satisfaction to be found. That which is confined to a life of nature is unable of itself to go beyond its immediate existence, but by something other than itself it is forced beyond that, and to be thus wrenched out of its setting is its death. Consciousness, however, is to itself its own notion, thereby it immediately transcends what is limited, and, since this latter belongs to it, consciousness transcends its own self. Along with the particular there is at the same time set up the beyond, were this only, as in spatial intuition, beside what is limited. Consciousness, therefore, suffers this violence at its own hands, it destroys its own limited satisfaction. When feeling of violence, anxiety for the truth may well withdraw, and struggle to preserve for itself that which is in danger of being lost. But it can find no rest. Should that anxious fearfulness wish to remain always in unthinking indolence, thought will agitate the thoughtlessness, its restlessness will disturb that indolence. Or let it take its stand as a form of sentimentality which assures us it finds everything good in its kind, and this assurance likewise will suffer violence at the hands of reason, which finds something not good just because and in so far as it is a kind. Or, again, fear of the truth may conceal itself from itself and others behind the pretext that precisely burning zeal for the very truth makes it so difficult, nay impossible, to find any other truth except that of which alone vanity is capable, that of being ever so much cleverer than any ideas, which one gets from oneself or others, could make possible. This sort of conceit which understands how to belittle every truth and turn away from it back into itself, and gloats over this its own private understanding, which always knows how to dissipate every possible thought, and to find, instead of all the content, merely the barren ego, this is a satisfaction which must be left to itself, for it flees the universal and seeks only an isolated existence on its own account. As the foregoing has been stated, provisionally and in general, concerning the manner and the necessity of the process of the inquiry, it may also be of further service to make some observations regarding the method of carrying this out. This exposition, viewed as a process of relating science to phenomenal knowledge, and as an inquiry and critical examination into the reality of knowing, does not seem able to be effected without some presupposition which is laid down as an ultimate criterion. For an examination consists in applying an accepted standard, and, on the final agreement or disagreement therewith of what is tested, deciding whether the latter is right or wrong, and the standard in general, and so science, were this the criterion, is thereby accepted as the essence or inherently real. But, here, where science first appears on the scene, neither science nor any sort of standard has justified itself as the essence or ultimate reality, and without this no examination seems able to be instituted. This contradiction and the removal of it will become more definite if, to begin with, we call to mind the abstract determinations of knowledge and of truth as they are found in consciousness. Consciousness, we find, distinguishes from itself something, to which at the same time it relates itself, or, to use the current expression, there is something for consciousness, and the determinate form of this process of relating, or of there being something for a consciousness, is knowledge. But from this being for another we distinguish being in itself or per se. What is related to knowledge is likewise distinguished from it, and posited as also existing outside this relation. The aspect of being per se or in itself is called truth. What really lies in these determinations does not further concern us here, for since the object of our inquiry is phenomenal knowledge, its determinations are also taken up, in the first instance, as they are immediately offered to us. And they are offered to us very much in the way we have just stated. If now our inquiry deals with the truth of knowledge, it appears that we are inquiring what knowledge is in itself. But in this inquiry knowledge is our object, it is for us, and the essential nature of knowledge, were this to come to light, would be rather its being for us. What we should assert to be its essence would rather be, not the truth of knowledge, but only our knowledge of it. The essence or the criterion would lie in us, and that which was to be compared with this standard, and on which a decision was to be passed as a result of this comparison, would not necessarily have to recognize that criterion. But the nature of the object which we are examining surmounts this separation, or semblance of separation, and presupposition. Consciousness furnishes its own criterion in itself, and the inquiry will thereby be a comparison of itself with its own self, for the distinction, just made, falls inside itself. In consciousness there is one element for another, or, in general, consciousness implicates the specific character of the moment of knowledge. At the same time, this other is to consciousness not merely for it, but also outside this relation, or has a being in itself, that is to say, there is the moment of truth. Thus in what consciousness inside itself declares to be the essence or truth, we have the standard which itself sets up, and by which we are to measure its knowledge. Suppose we call knowledge the notion, and the essence or truth being or the object, then the examination consists in seeing whether the notion corresponds with the object. But if we call the inner nature of the object, or what it is in itself, the notion, and, on the other side, understand by object the notion qua object, specifically, the way the notion is for an other, then the examination consists in our seeing whether the object corresponds to its own notion. It is clear, of course, that both of these processes are the same. The essential fact, however, to be borne in mind throughout the whole inquiry is that both these moments, notion and object, being for another and being in itself, themselves fall within that knowledge which we are examining. Consequently, we do not require to bring standards with us, nor to apply our fancies and thoughts in the inquiry, and just by our leaving these aside, we are enabled to treat and discuss the subject as it actually is in itself and for itself, as it is in its complete reality. But not only in this respect, that notion and object, the criterion and what is to be tested, are ready to hand in consciousness itself, is any addition of ours superfluous, but we are also spared the trouble of comparing these two and of making an examination in the strict sense of the term, so that in this respect, too, since consciousness tests and examines itself, all we are left to do is simply and solely to look on. For consciousness is, on the one hand, consciousness of the object, on the other, consciousness of itself, consciousness of what to it is true, and consciousness of its knowledge of that truth. Since both are for the same consciousness, it is itself their comparison, it is the same consciousness that decides and knows whether its knowledge of the object corresponds with this object or not. The object, it is true, appears only to be in such wise for consciousness as consciousness knows it. Consciousness does not seem able to get, so to say, behind it as it is, not for consciousness, but in itself, and consequently seems also unable to test knowledge by it. But just because consciousness has, in general, knowledge of an object, there is already present the distinction that the inherent nature, what the object is in itself, is one thing to consciousness, while knowledge, or the being of the object for consciousness, is another moment. Upon this distinction, which is present as a fact, the examination turns. Should both, when thus compared, not correspond, consciousness seems bound to alter its knowledge, in order to make it fit the object. But in the alteration of the knowledge, the object itself also, in point of fact, is altered, for the knowledge which existed was essentially a knowledge of the object. With change in the knowledge, the object also becomes different, since it belonged essentially to this knowledge. Hence consciousness comes to find that what formerly to it was the essence is not what is per se, or what was per se was only per se for consciousness. Since, then, in the case of its object consciousness finds its knowledge not corresponding with this object, the object likewise fails to hold out, or the standard for examining is altered when that, whose criterion this standard was to be, does not hold its ground in the course of the examination, and the examination is not only an examination of knowledge, but also of the criterion used in the process. This dialectic process which consciousness executes on itself, on its knowledge as well as on its object in the sense that out of it the new and true object arises, is precisely what is termed experience. In this connection, there is a moment in the process just mentioned which should be brought into more decided prominence, and by which a new light is cast on the scientific aspect of the following exposition. Consciousness knows something. This something is the essence or is per se. This object, however, is also the per se, the inherent reality, for consciousness. Hence comes ambiguity of this truth. Consciousness, as we see, has now two objects, one is the first per se, the second is the existence for consciousness of this per se. The last object appears at first sight to be merely the reflection of consciousness into itself, that is, an idea not of an object, but solely of its knowledge of that first object. But, as was already indicated, by that very process the first object is altered, it ceases to be what is per se, and becomes consciously something which is per se only for consciousness. Consequently, then, what this real per se is for consciousness is truth, which, however, means that this is the essential reality, or the object which consciousness has. This new object contains the nothingness of the first, the new object is the experience concerning that first object. In this treatment of the course of experience, there is an element in virtue of which it does not seem to be in agreement with what is ordinarily understood by experience. The transition from the first object and the knowledge of it to the other object, in regard to which we say we have had experience, was so stated that the knowledge of the first object, the existence for consciousness of the first ens per se, is itself to be the second object. But it usually seems that we learn by experience the untruth of our first notion by appealing to some other object which we may happen to find casually and externally, so that, in general, what we have is merely the bare and simple apprehension of what is in and for itself. On the view above given, however, the new object is seen to have come about by a transformation or conversion of consciousness itself. This way of looking at the matter is our doing, what we contribute. By its means the series of experiences through which consciousness passes is lifted into a scientifically constituted sequence, but this does not exist for the consciousness we contemplate and consider. We have here, however, the same sort of circumstance, again, of which we spoke a short time ago when dealing with the relation of this exposition to skepticism, for example, that the result which at any time comes about in the case of an untrue mode of knowledge cannot possibly collapse into an empty nothing, but must necessarily be taken as the negation of that of which it is a result which contains what truth the preceding mode of knowledge has in it. In the present instance the position takes this form, since what at first appeared as object is reduced, when it passes into consciousness, to what knowledge takes it to be, and the implicit nature, the real in itself, becomes what this entity per se, is for consciousness. This latter is the new object, whereupon there appears also a new mode or embodiment of consciousness, of which the essence is something other than that of the preceding mode. It is this circumstance which carries forward the whole succession of the modes or attitudes of consciousness in their own necessity. It is only this necessity, this origination of the new object which offers itself to consciousness without consciousness knowing how it comes by it, that to us, who watch the process, is to be seen going on, so to say, behind its back. Thereby there enters into its process a moment of being per se, or of being for us, which is not expressly presented to that consciousness which is in the grip of experience itself. The content, however, of what we see arising, exists for it, and we lay hold of and comprehend merely its formal character, that is, its bare origination. For it, what has thus arisen has merely the character of object, while, for us, it appears at the same time as a process in coming into being. In virtue of that necessity, this pathway to science is itself, and is, moreover, as regards its content, science of the experience of consciousness. The experience which consciousness has concerning itself can, by its essential principle, embrace nothing less than the entire system of consciousness, the whole realm of the truth of mind, and in such wise that the moments of truth are set forth in the specific and peculiar character they here possess, that is to say, not as abstract pure moments, but as they are for consciousness, or as consciousness itself appears in its relation to them, and in virtue of which they are moments of the whole. Are embodiments or modes of consciousness. In pressing forward to its true form of existence, consciousness will come to a point at which it lays aside its semblance of being hampered with what is foreign to it, with what is only for it and exists as an other. It will reach a position where appearance becomes identified with essence, where, in consequence, its exposition coincides with just this very point, this very stage of the science proper of mind. And, finally, when it grasps this its own essence, it will connote the nature of absolute knowledge itself. Part A. Consciousness. Section 1. Certainty at the level of sense experience. The this, and meaning. The knowledge, which is at the start or immediately our object, can be nothing else than just that which is immediate knowledge, knowledge of the immediate, of what is. We have, in dealing with it, to proceed, to, in an immediate way, to accept what is given, not altering anything in it as it is presented before us, and keeping mere apprehension free from conceptual comprehension. The concrete content, which sensuous certainty furnishes, makes this prima facie appear to be the richest kind of knowledge, to be even a knowledge of endless wealth, a wealth to which we can as little find any limit when we traverse its extent in space and time, where that content is presented before us, as when we take a fragment out of the abundance it offers us and by dividing and dividing seek to penetrate its intent. Besides that, it seems to be the truest, the most authentic knowledge, for it has not as yet dropped anything from the object, it has the object before itself in its entirety and completeness. This bare fact of certainty, however, is really and admittedly the abstractest and the poorest kind of truth. It merely says regarding what it knows, it is, and its truth contains solely the being of the fact it knows. Consciousness, on its part, in the case of this form of certainty, takes the shape merely of pure ego. In other words, I in such a case am merely qua pure this, and the object likewise is merely qua pure this. I, this particular conscious I, am certain of this fact before me, not because I qua consciousness have developed myself in connection with it and in manifold ways set thought to work about it, and not, again, because the fact, the thing, of which I am certain, in virtue of its having a multitude of distinct qualities, was replete with possible modes of relation and a variety of connections with other things. Neither has anything to do with the truth sensuous certainty contains, neither the I nor the thing has here the meaning of a manifold relation with a variety of other things, of mediation in a variety of ways. The I does not contain or imply a manifold of ideas, the I here does not think, nor does the thing mean what has a multiplicity of qualities. Rather, the thing, the fact, is, and it is merely because it is. It is that is the essential point for sense knowledge, and that bare fact of being, that simple immediacy, constitutes its truth. In the same way, the certainty qua relation, the certainty of something, is an immediate pure relation, consciousness is I nothing more, a pure this. The individual consciousness knows a pure this, or knows what is individual. But, when we look closely, there is a good deal more implied in that bare pure being, which constitutes the kernel of this form of certainty, and is given out by it as its truth. A concrete actual certainty of sense is not merely this pure immediacy, but an example, an instance, of that immediacy. Amongst the innumerable distinctions that here come to light, we find in all cases the fundamental difference, for example, that in sense experience pure being at once breaks up into the two thises, as we have called them, one this as I, and one as object. When we reflect on this distinction, it is seen that neither the one nor the other is merely immediate, merely is in sense certainty, but is at the same time mediated. I have the certainty through the other, for example, through the actual fact, and this, again, exists in that certainty through an other, for example, through the I. It is not only we who make this distinction of essential truth and particular example, of essence and instance, immediacy and mediation, we find it in sense certainty itself, and it has to be taken up in the form in which it exists there, not as we have just determined it. One of them is put forward in it as existing in simple immediacy, as the essential reality, the object. The other, however, is put forward as the non-essential, as mediated, something which is not per se in the certainty, but there through something else, ego, a state of knowledge which only knows the object because the object is, and which can as well be as not be. The object, however, is the real truth, is the essential reality, it is, quite indifferent to whether it is known or not, it remains and stands even though it is not known, while the knowledge does not exist if the object is not there. We have thus to consider as to the object, whether in point of fact it does exist in sense certainty itself as such an essential reality as that certainty gives it out to be, whether its meaning and notion, which is to be essential reality, corresponds to the way it is present in that certainty. We have for that purpose not to reflect about it and ponder what it might be in truth, but to deal with it merely as sense certainty contains it. Sense certainty itself has thus to be asked, what is the this? If we take it in the twofold form of its existence, as the now and as the here, the dialectic it has in it will take a form as intelligible as the this itself. To the question, what is the now? We reply, for example, the now is night time. To test the truth of this certainty of sense, a simple experiment is all we need. Write that truth down. A truth cannot lose anything by being written down, and just as little by our preserving and keeping it. If we look again at the truth we have written down, look at it now, at this noon time, we shall have to say it has turned stale and become out of date. The now that is night is kept fixed, explicitly, it is treated as what it is given out to be, as something which is, but it proves to be rather as something which is not. The now itself no doubt maintains itself, but as what is not night. Similarly in its relation to the day which the now is at present, it maintains itself as something that is also not day, or as altogether something negative. This self-maintaining now is therefore not something immediate but something mediated, for, qua something that remains and preserves itself, it is determined through and by means of the fact that something else, namely day and night, is not. Thereby it is just as much as ever it was before, now, and in being this simple fact, it is indifferent to what is still associated with it, just as little as night or day is its being, it is just as truly also day and night, it is not in the least affected by this otherness through which it is what it is. A simple entity of this sort, which is by and through negation, which is neither this nor that, which is a not this, and with equal indifference this as well as that a thing of this kind we call a universal. The universal is therefore in point of fact the truth of sense certainty, the true content of sense experience. It is as a universal, too, that we give utterance to sensuous fact. What we say is, this, to wit, the universal this, or we say, it is, explicitly, being in general. Of course, we do not present before our mind in saying, so the universal this, or being in general, but we utter what is universal. In other words, we do not actually and absolutely say what in this sense certainty we really mean. Language, however, as we see, is the more truthful. In it we ourselves refute directly and at once our own meaning, and since universality is the real truth of sense certainty, and language merely expresses this truth, it is not possible at all for us even to express in words any sensuous existence which we mean. The same will be the case when we take the here, the other form of the this. The here is for example, the tree. I turn about and this truth has disappeared and has changed round into its opposite. The here is not a tree, but a house. The here itself does not disappear, it is and remains in the disappearance of the house, tree, and so on, and is indifferently house, tree. The this is shown thus again to be mediated simplicity, in other words, to be universality. Pure being, then, remains as the essential element for this sense certainty, since sense certainty in its very nature proves the universal to be the truth of its object. But that pure being is not in the form of something immediate, but of something in which the process of negation and mediation is essential. Consequently, it is not what we intend or mean by being, but being with the characteristic that it is an abstraction, the purely universal, and our intended meaning, which takes the truth of sense certainty to be not something universal, is alone left standing in contrast to this empty, indifferent now and here. If we compare the relation in which knowledge and the object first stood with the relation they have come to assume in this result, it is found to be just the reverse of what first appeared. The object, which professed to be the essential reality, is now the non-essential element of sense certainty, for the universal, which the object has come to be, is no longer such as the object essentially was to be for sense certainty. The certainty is now found to lie in the opposite element, namely in knowledge, which formerly was the non-essential factor. Its truth lies in the object as my object, or lies in the meaning, in what I mean, it is, because I know it. Sense certainty is thus indeed banished from the object, but it is not yet thereby done away with, it is merely forced back into the I. We have still to see what experience reveals regarding its reality in this sense. The force of its truth thus lies now in the I, in the immediate fact of my seeing, hearing, and so on. The disappearance of the particular now and here that we mean is prevented by the fact that I keep hold on them. The now is daytime, because I see it, the here is a tree for a similar reason. Sense certainty, however, goes through, in this connection, the same dialectic process as in the former case. I, see the tree, and assert the tree to be the here. Another I, however, sees the house and maintains the here is not a tree but a house. Both truths have the same authenticity, the immediacy of seeing and the certainty and assurance both have as to their specific way of knowing, but the one certainty disappears in the other. In all this, what does not disappear is the I qua universal, whose seeing is neither the seeing of this tree nor of this house, but just seeing simpliciter, which is mediated through the negation of this house, etc., and, in being so, is all the same simple and indifferent to what is associated with it, the house, the tree, and so on. I is merely universal, like now, here, or this in general. No doubt I mean an individual I, but just something as little as I am able to say what I mean by now, here, so it is impossible in the case of the I too. By saying this here, this now, an individual thing, I say all this is, heres, nouse, or individuals. In the same way when I say I, this individual I say quite generally all I's, every one is I, this individual I. When philosophy is requested, by way of putting it to a crucial test, a test which it could not possibly sustain, to deduce, to construe, to find a priori, or however it is put, a so-called this thing, or this particular man, it is reasonable that the person making this demand should say what this thing, or what this he means, but to say this is quite impossible. Sense certainty discovers by experience, therefore, that its essential nature lies neither in the object nor in the I, and that the immediacy peculiar to it is neither an immediacy of the one nor of the other. For, in the case of both, what I mean is rather something non-essential, and the object and the I are universals, in which that now and here and I, which I mean, do not hold out, do not exist. We arrive in this way at the result, that we have to put the whole, of sense certainty as its essential reality, and no longer merely one of its moments, as happened in both cases, where first the object as against the I, and then the I, was to be its true reality. Thus it is only the whole sense certainty itself which persists therein as immediacy, and in consequence excludes from itself all the opposition which in the foregoing had a place there. This pure immediacy, then, has nothing more to do with the fact of otherness, with here in the form of a tree passing into a here that is not a tree, with now in the sense of daytime changing into a now that is nighttime, or with there being an other I to which something else is object. Its truth stands fast as a self-identical relation, making no distinction of essential and non-essential, between I and object, and into which, therefore, in general, no distinction can find its way. I assert, then, the here as tree, and do not turn round so that for me here might become not a tree, and I take no notice of the fact that another I finds the here as not tree, or that I myself at some other time take the here as not tree, the now as not day. I am directly conscious, I intuit and nothing more, I am pure intuition, I am seeing, looking. For myself I stand by the fact, the now is daytime, or, again, by the fact the here is tree, and, again, do not compare here and now themselves with one another, I take my stand on one immediate relation, the now is day. Since, then, This certainty wholly refuses to come out. If we direct its attention to a now that is night or an I to whom it is night, we will go to it and let ourselves point out the now that is asserted. We must let ourselves point it out, for the truth of this immediate relation is the truth of this ego which restricts itself to a now or a here. Were we to examine this truth afterwards, or stand at a distance from it, it would have no meaning at all, for that would do away with the immediacy, which is of its essence. We have therefore to enter the same point of time or of space, indicate them, point them out to ourselves, that is, we must let ourselves take the place of the very same I, the very same this, which is the subject knowing with certainty. Let us, then, see how that immediate is constituted, which is shown to us. The now is pointed out, this now. Now, it has already ceased to be when it is pointed out. The now that is other than the one indicated, and we see that the now is just this, to be no longer the very time when it is. The now as it is shown to us is one that has been, and that is its truth. It does not have the truth of being, of something that is. No doubt this is true, that it has been, but what has been is in point of fact not genuinely real, it is not, and the point in question concerned what is, concerned being. In thus pointing out the now we see then merely a process which takes the following course. First I point out the now, and it is asserted to be the truth. I point it out, however, as something that has been, or as something cancelled and done away with. I thus annul and pass beyond that first truth, and in the second place I now assert as the second truth that it has been, that it is superseded. But, thirdly, what has been is not, I then supersede, cancel, its having been, the fact of its being annulled, the second truth, negate thereby the negation of the now, and return in so doing to the first position, that now is. The now and pointing out the now are thus so constituted that neither the one nor the other is an immediate simple fact, but a process with diverse moments in it. This is set up, it is, however, rather an other that is set up, the this is superseded, and this otherness, this cancelling of the former, is itself again annulled, and so turned back to the first. But this first, reflected thus into itself, is not exactly the same as it was to begin with, namely something immediate, rather it is a something reflected into self, a simple entity which remains in its otherness, what it is, a now which is any number of nows. And that is the genuinely true now. The now is simple daytime, which has many nows within it hours. A now of that sort, again an hour is similarly many minutes, and this now a minute in the same way many nows, and so on. Showing, indicating, pointing out the now is thus itself the very process which expresses what the now in truth really is, namely a result, or a plurality of nows all taken together. And the pointing out is the way of getting to know, of experiencing, that now is a universal. The here pointed out, which I keep hold of, is likewise a this here which, in fact, is not this here, but a before and behind, an above and below, a right and left. The above is itself likewise this manifold otherness above, below, etc. The here, which was to be pointed out, disappears in other heres, and these disappear similarly. What is pointed out, held fast, and is permanence a negative this, which only is so when the heres are taken as they should be, but therein cancel one another, it is a simple complex of many heres. The here that is meant would be the point. But it is not, rather, when it is pointed out as being, as having existence, that very act of pointing out proves to be not immediate knowledge, but a process, a movement from the here meant through a plurality of heres to the universal here, which is a simple plurality of heres, just as day is a simple plurality of nows. It is clear from all this that the dialectic process involved in sense certainty is nothing else than the mere history of its process of its experience, and sense certainty itself is nothing else than simply this history. The naive consciousness, too, for that reason, is of itself always coming to this result, which is the real truth in this case, and is always having experience of it, but is always forgetting it again and beginning the process all over. It is therefore astonishing when, in defiance of this experience, it is announced as universal experience, nay, even as a philosophical doctrine, the outcome, in fact, of skepticism that the reality or being of external things in the sense of this is, particular sense objects, has absolute validity and truth for consciousness. One who makes such an assertion really does not know what he is saying, does not know that he is stating the opposite of what he wants to say. The truth for consciousness of this of sense is said to be universal experience, but the very opposite is universal experience. Every consciousness of itself cancels again, as soon as made, such a truth as, for example, the here is a tree, or the now is noon, and expresses the very opposite, the here is not a tree but a house. And similarly it straightway cancels again the assertion which here annuls the first, and which is also just such an assertion of a sensuous this. And in all sense certainty what we find by experience is in truth merely, as we have seen, that this is a universal, the very opposite of what that assertion maintained to be universal experience. We may be permitted here, in this appeal to universal experience, to anticipate with a reference to the practical sphere. In this connection we may answer those who thus insist on the truth and certainty of the reality of objects of sense, by saying that they had better be sent back to the most elementary school of wisdom, the ancient Eleusinian mysteries of Ceres and Bacchus. They have not yet learnt the inner secret of the eating of bread and the drinking of wine. For one who is initiated into these mysteries not only comes to doubt the being of things of sense, but gets into a state of despair about it altogether, and in dealing with them he partly himself brings about the nothingness of those things, partly he sees these bring about their own nothingness. Even animals are not shut off from this wisdom, but show they are deeply initiated into it. For they do not stand stock still before things of sense as if these were things per se, with being in themselves, they despair of this reality altogether, and in complete assurance of the nothingness of things they fall to without more ado and eat them up. And all nature proclaims, as animals do, these open secrets, these mysteries revealed to all, which teach what the truth of things of sense is. Those who put forward such assertions really themselves say, if we bear in mind what we remarked before, the direct opposite of what they mean, a fact which is perhaps best able to bring them to reflect on the nature of the certainty of sense experience. They speak of the existence of external objects, which can be more precisely characterized as actual, absolutely particular, wholly personal, individual things, each of them not like anything or anyone else. This is the existence which they say has absolute certainty and truth. They mean this bit of paper I am writing on, or rather have written on, but they do not say what they mean. If they really wanted to say this bit of paper which they mean, and they wanted to say so, that is impossible, because the this of sense, which is meant, cannot be reached by language, which belongs to consciousness, to be precise, to what is inherently universal. In the very attempt to say it, it would, therefore, crumble in their hands. Those who have begun to describe it would not be able to finish doing so, they would have to hand it over to others, who would themselves in the last resort have to confess to speaking about a thing that has no being. They mean, then, doubtless this bit of paper here, which is quite different from that bit over there, but they speak of actual things, external or sensible objects, absolutely individual, real, and so on, that is, they say about them what is simply universal. Consequently what is called unspeakable is nothing else than what is untrue, irrational, something barely and simply meant. If nothing is said of a thing except that it is an actual thing, an external object, this only makes it the most universal of all possible things, and thereby we express its likeness, its identity, with everything, rather than its difference from everything else. When I say an individual thing, I at once state it to be really quite a universal, for everything is an individual thing, and in the same way this thing is everything and anything we like. More precisely, as this bit of paper, each and every paper is this bit of paper, and I have thus said all the while what is universal. If I want, however, to help out speech which has the divine nature of directly turning the mere meaning right round about, making it into something else, and so not letting it ever come the length of words at all by pointing out this bit of paper, then I get the experience of what is, in point of fact, the real truth of sense certainty. I point it out as a here, which is a here of other heres, or is in itself simply many heres together, specifically, is a universal. I take it up then, as in truth it is, and instead of knowing something immediate, I take something truly, I perceive.